look at what we were doing last time. All right, so we had our player one, player two scripts, right? And we kind of played around with having these guys talk back and forth just to show we can have game objects communicating with each other last time. And then we started saying, okay, well, what if I want to start bringing some data structures in where we have some logical code that isn't going to be attached to a game object, but instead I needed to kind of store some information, things like that. So we introduced our player class last time, where a player has a name and has a number of hit points. And again, notice this guy is not a mono behavior. He's a normal plain Jane C# class. You can't hang him onto a game object as a component, but things that are hung onto game objects, like other mono behaviors, they can create instances of that class and do stuff with it and things like that. Okay. So this is if we start thinking ahead to like our dungeon crawler or whatever the game kind of morphs into, you kind of have the interface, what you visually see being presented on the screen with your dude moving through rooms in a dungeon or whatever. And then you have kind of like the who's keeping score behind the scenes. So your actual instances of objects that can keep track of, oh, we have 3 different players who have this amount of hit points, this left whatever, and these are their names. We may have a couple of monsters and they have a name and some hit points and whatever, but we have these different instances of things that they live not as something visual on the screen, but as kind of information, almost like maybe like a driver's license or something like that those objects might be keeping in their pocket about who they are. So in an effort to kind of bring those two worlds together a little bit, I think the assignment for today was somehow get your players showing their hit points and stuff above them or something like that, right? So we had some way of visually looking at our game here, and when we hit play, this would be, I don't know, is this Mike? This would be Mike with whatever hit points. This would be Dave with however many hit points. So we see that information coming visually onto the screen. Make some sense? Okay, so there's kind of several different types of game objects you could use to accomplish this type of thing. If you you might have started off by going into your 3D objects and kind of browsing through, and we see this thing called a TextMeshPro. There's some other ways of accomplishing this. Really, the thing I wanted you to get out of this from when you did the tutorial and we had the kind of like your game score and all that stuff, that was like this total backdrop for the entire view, right? That wasn't attached to an individual game object. That's just, so that wouldn't really be what we want to have here unless you're going to just kind of have like a little box up in the upper left-hand corner that says all the people that are on the screen, and maybe has like, he's the green guy, he's the blue guy, or something like that. It's not really traveling around with them. So that really wouldn't be the best fit for this, but having a text mesh might work. So this is a game object. So when you first import that, it wants you to import some extra things. So I'll import the essentials. I don't actually think I need the examples and extras, but I'll do it anyways in case there's a library in there that we end up using. All right, so now I have this this text mesh thing. All right, so if we, let's call this guy okay, well, I mean, that's fine, but you're going to see it's probably not the correct solution for this type of thing because the canvas is something you see from everywhere. All right, so let's just start by, I forgot to bring my mouse today, so we'll just do So let's update the text on this guy. So here we'll just say player name for right now. All right, and you can adjust font and things like that in here, or at least the size somewhere. So here, let's drop this down to maybe, I don't know what to oh, go with that. All right. So we just have something that says player name on it. It's there in the scene. And notice initially this guy has, he's pretty he's taking up a lot of space. Now he is currently his own game object. Now, we have a couple of ways we can handle this. So this comes down to how do you think about game objects location on the screen. So for any game object, what is the component that tells us where it is on the screen? Okay, it's going to be the position component of the transform, right? So we have this transform that's kind of that lowest common denominator of all game objects, and that holds 3 vector 3s. Where is it? How's it rotating? And what's its scale, right? Okay, and in this case, we're probably not going to be messing around with rotation and well, we might end up doing something with rotation soon, but probably not with scale. We'll just size it to where we want it. But we want to now have it in position with the player. Okay, so a couple of things we can do here. So on one hand, we might say, well, why don't we go ahead and allow the player, we'll say player one initially, to have access to his own text mesh. So if I want to programmatically have access to this text mesh from within player one script, I'll need to create a public variable inside of player one script, which would then allow me to drag this in. So let's go and look at that particular example. So I'll go to my player one controller. Up top here, we're going to say public text mesh. I thought it's TextMeshPro, or is it just text mesh? Well, I guess we're going to find out. All right, so I'll just make it a public variable of type text mesh, and we'll see if this is the right kind of animal. So now if I go ahead and click on player one, and I go down to his script, notice he's now waiting for this variable of type text mesh. And I can take this and drag this guy over there. Okay, he's not a normal text mesh. He's a TextMeshPro, and TextMeshPro must live in a different Unity TextMeshPro call it location. Is it under the UI, Unity.UI stuff? Using Unity engine dot UI. Where do you live? Here, TextMeshPro. Worst case, we could just go the other direction. What's up? Do we know what it is? EMP. Oh, that guy? For it's a part of a namespace. So using TM Pro. No, that sounds reasonable enough to me. There it is. Thank you. All right, so now we have, well, we would have accomplished it two different ways. So this uses the TM Pro namespace, so it brings all the stuff from there, but we could have said, we could have brought it in from a different library, or is that its own library? I guess it's its own library. Okay. Whatever. All right, so we have our TextMeshPro. So now I should be able to drag that guy in there. Let's give that another shot. There we go. All right, so now this is one of those things where I think I had mentioned when we first were looking at Unity, some of you might decide you want to kind of change your arrangement of how Unity is laid out, because you notice it's going to be fairly common that we're going to be dragging game objects over into scripts like we just did. So sometimes having this guy relocated over here on the right, so you have less, distance you have to drag the thing, could be helpful. So, you can choose. All right, so just for right now, I want to make sure I can see player name here. Okay, so we see player name sitting there. We're going to change its location, but let's just prove that we have access to it now. So inside of start, we're going to say tm.text is equal to, I'm just going to set it equal to Mike here. So we're programmatically changing it from player name to Mike. We're not getting Mike from the right place yet, but we're programmatically changing it. All right, so there's us having some programmatic control over that TextMeshPro game object that we made available to our script by giving ourselves a public variable inside the script. MVC in action. Okay, model view controller. All right. So now let's go ahead and get the name coming from the correct place. So we go into our player object. We see that we have a name and a hit point. Both of these guys are private, right? So if we want them to be publicly available, we're going to have to go ahead and write some getters so we can at least get that information, right? So we're going to say public string get name. This guy will return this dot name. And we'll go ahead and put in the public int get HP. And we'll return this .ht. All right, so we upgraded our player class to give us read-only access outside of this to our private fields. Make sense? All right, and I hopefully you picked up from the way I've done things over the last year now. But I like to kind of let programs grow organically. Don't try to solve too much of a problem too soon, because then what you'll be stuck with is you'll have 50 features that you thought, oh, I might need that, and you've put in there that end up just being a mess on the screen, and you end up not using them. So in this case, we had our basic player object. We saw that, oh, I need the ability to get the player's name from outside of this player class. So I need to give that ability. We gave it that ability to get the name. So now over here in player one controller, instead of hard coding it as Mike, we can say this dot the player dot get name. So we'll ask the instance of our player to get that player's name. And we know that works because when we wrote that function, get name, notice it is not a static function. Therefore, it's owned by an instance of the class. So every instance of the player class will have their own get name function, and we need an instance of the class in order to call it. So we used our local instance of the player class that we built right here to get the name of this particular player. Okay. Now we wanted to go ahead and we can go ahead and do something like concatenate onto that and maybe put an arrow for, I guess, no good reason, and we'll say this dot the player dot get HP. So we'll get both the name and the hit points. Just a little arrow in between them or something like that. Call that good enough. All right, so we're doing all of that programmatically. So now when we go and run this, we'll see we have our player name and the hit points that pop up there. But we now have, so now we got the data sources connected, right? I got a way of displaying it on the screen. I got a way of storing it inside of an instance of our player object. We got a way of getting those two things connected together. But now we probably want to have our text mesh to be not just floating up in the sky somewhere, but kind of near our player. So you might initially say, well, why can't we just drag it over there? You know, so who is player one? Is this, that's player one? And there's my text mesh. You know, so I could do something like that. And then bring it in for a better landing. Something like that. It's probably technically not quite over his head right now. All right, now it probably is. All right. Now we might say, okay, it's still a little bit, the text is too big or something like that, or we want it a little bit lower on the screen. But in that type of thing, we're kind of manually kind of dragging it around. We really have two separate game objects on the screen. We have our player one and we have our text mesh. We want those guys to kind of be able to behave as one. All right. Now, one way we could accomplish this is purely programmatically. So we can go ahead and just say, well, let's just change the text mesh's location to be relative to where the player currently is, and then maybe elevate it above his head a little bit, something like that. So if we go that route, I can actually drag my text mesh anywhere I want over here, right? And it's the player one script that knows about this guy currently. So if I go into the player one script, after I set the text, I can go ahead and update the transform for our text mesh. So I can say this dot tm dot transform dot position is equal to, we're going to say a new vector 3. Yeah. And the vector 3, we're going to set it to, we want it to be the same X and Z of the game object that's associated with this script. So associated with player one. So this dot game object dot transform. You actually could just say this dot transform. It's like a syntactic sugar bypass, but I like being explicit. So this dot game object dot transform dot position dot X. Then we'll do the dot Y. Now the Y one, that's the one that's kind of up in the air. So why don't we add I don't know, 5 to it for right now. And then we'll also do the Z, we'll put it in the exact same Z location. Oh, it almost looked pretty cool. What'd you do? All right, call that good enough. All right, so we're going to set the TextMeshPro's transforms position to a brand new vector 3, XYZ coordinate, saying we want it to be at the same X coordinate as what the game object that this script is attached to. We want it to be the same Z coordinate, And we want it to be the same Y coordinate, but let's float it up in the air a little bit so it's kind of above it. We might have to adjust that 5 a little bit. All right, but in this case, we're doing it 100% programmatically, right? Not doing any dragging or anything like that. All right, so we see before we hit play, everything is definitely in separate places. We'll go ahead and hit play. Doesn't seem like he moved as much as I would have expected him to move. So I'm going to change something here. If you've looked at, this is an opportunity to talk about the transforms. If I say this dot game object dot, we have something called, we have a couple different transforms. I think it's called, actually, is it one transform, but then there's a local position. Yeah, we have a transform that is, we have a position and we have a local position. So local position is the position of the transform relative to its parent transform. We're going to be using that here in a few minutes. As opposed to, and I want, when I say parent transform, you can put objects inside of objects. So you can think of a game object as almost like a folder. All right. So the game object itself already has stuff associated with it. You know, it has its own transform and stuff like that, and other components, whatever. But it can also have other things that have transforms in that folder as subcomponents of that. So things can be positioned relative to the parent. All right. So if we're doing something relative to whoever the parent transform is, we might use local position. We use regular position when we want to do something relative to the entire world space. Okay. One's not better or worse than the other. It just comes down to what you're trying to accomplish. All right. So just for the sake of argument right here, I'm setting this guy's transform. I want to say, I just want to move something real quick, and then I'll give the example. No, that's not really any better. So one thing I was thinking is that it's possible that the game object doesn't actually have a official location when a script first starts, because it maybe isn't on the screen yet. Let's see what we could do here. Let's just make sure I'm not lying to you about that this dot game object dot transform and this dot transform are two different things. Pretty positive I'm not, but I just want to confirm it. Okay, good. All right, so let's go ahead and see. Maybe we're just looking at it from a different perspective, and it's not actually incorrect. So I'm going to change that Y to 1. Let's see if that's a little bit lower down to the ground. Okay, definitely lower down to the ground. So we actually might want to do it even more than that. But I also want it positioned over by the player. Why is that guy moving? Why is he so far to the left? Here's my camera scene. So right now he's not even on camera. Still not on camera. It should definitely be on camera now. Okay, yeah. So now you can see him on camera. So let me. Oh, I'm dragging the camera currently. Let me just move the mesh a little bit. Okay. I think he's definitely still on camera. Okay, he is. Now let's see if we get him closer. Yeah. Well, whatever. We're going to position it differently anyways. We can mess with the transform until we get it positioned just right. We also have to consider our camera is kind of at an angle and all this stuff where if we have it straight on, you know, that might be a different situation. So what we can do here is we can take our player one mesh and drag it underneath our player one. So now he is a subcomponent of our player one. All right. And then we can go ahead and set the mesh's position to 0, 0, 0. We want to. All right, so notice that puts him offset from the player. So if I kind of drag this over a little bit, notice that his position on X actually needs to be about a 6. So this must have been where it must have been the upper left-hand corner, maybe where the TextMeshPro's location was. So we could add X, 6 to the X to get it positioned over it. And actually, his height looks pretty decent. Is it because he's kind of in front of it? Yeah, so it looks like TextMeshPros sort of have their own little weird offset to make themselves work. So I made it a child of player one, and then I just positioned it where I wanted to, but now those guys come together. But when I made it a child of player one, I was able to set this guy's XYZ position to 0, 0, 0. That's his local position, his position relative to his parent. And then we saw that, oh, actually, to get it looking right, we had to move it to, let's say, a 6. All right. So now I've done that, I can go back over to code and I can say, oh, well, we no longer need to adjust his position here programmatically. Now, does that mean that doing it programmatically is worse than doing it physically? Not necessarily. You want to think about what's the right tool for the job. But now a cool feature that you get from doing it the way that I've done it here is if I take player one and I move it, notice that his text mesh comes with him now because its location is relative to his location. And when I move a folder, I'm moving everything that's in the folder as well. Make some sense? So kind of right tool for the job type thing. All right, so similarly over here, I can create a second text mesh. I'll put this on player two. I think I could start off by just saying reset. So if you put something on something else and you want to initially move it to a 0, 0 position relative to the parent, I'll just say refresh. I think that'll do 0, 0, 0. All right, so this is that. We probably want to name this guy player two mesh. And it is currently ginormous, or I have no idea what reason. Ah, there's the player name up there. Yeah, so that guy's height and width is 20 by 5. So it really didn't copy it very well. 20 by 5. What'd you do? I didn't like the way that copied. I'm going to delete that. I'm going to right click on this. I'm going to say add a 3D object, TextMeshPro. So if you right click on a game object, you could add something underneath that. So I'll call this guy player two mesh. Now it's positioned a little bit better. So apparently copying TextMeshPros isn't great. All right, so we'll leave it saying sample text or whatever for right now. If we're going to assume that it's going to be similar to what we had before, we're going to change its location on X by 6. We'll leave position on Y and Z alone. That seemed to position it at the right place. I'll just go ahead and hit play here. And we see that the giant text is associated with that right now. But we're going to be changing the text that's in there. So let's get the text size down to what the other one was. So I think I had it at 16 maybe. No, 12. Okay. All right, we're coming around. All right, so we could always maneuver it a little bit more if we wanted to, but let's just call that good enough. So what we want to do is we want to do something fairly similar to what we did with our player 1, and we're going to do this for player 2. So player 2, we're going to need to use our TextMeshPro guy here, so we have access to that library. We're going to now say public TextMeshPro TM. Now, one thing you can do, I'm going to call this kind of the correct way of doing what we're doing here, where I'm going to give myself a public variable of type TextMeshPro. I can come out here to Unity. I can click on my player 2, go down to the script. I now see that it's expecting there to be something dragged in here. Whenever you get weird behaviors in Unity and you're doing things with connecting things, using MVC within Unity, and you're getting weird behavior, make sure you go and check that you've dragged in all of the game objects you promised to drag in. Because we can write all the code we want inside of our script about our TextMeshPro here, but if we never actually provide it to the script, it's going to be talking to a null value. No text will be updating, and you'll get weird things. And imagine right now we only have like 4 things in our game, right? But as your games get a little bit larger, and all of a sudden you got 40 game objects or something, and half of them are generated programmatically, well, you get a lot of game objects, and it's easy to lose track of who did you promise what to. So make sure when you have a public thing to drag in, you connect it up with your first opportunity. So I'll go ahead and drag this guy over here. So now he's connected. Go back over to our script. We're going to do basically the same thing we did here. We typically would not want to repeat this amount of code, but we would probably want to have a single player kind of script that gets different names or something. But for right now, this gets our example going. So we'll set the text mesh associated with the player 2 controller's text equal to his instance of player's name, which is going to be Dave, and his instance of player's hit points, which will be whatever random number it rolled. All right, so there's Mike and Dave. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another game object in here. Do I want to do something weird? Let's just do a capsule, just so we have some of our different shapes out here. So we're going to call this guy destination. All right, and we can give him a color if we want. Let me see if he's on the camera. Yeah, he is. But actually, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to scroll out. I'm going to go from the top. I'm going to bring him towards the front of the scene kind of right underneath the camera. Because ultimately what we want to try to do is we want to have our objects move towards us. All right. So one way we can accomplish this is we can now use the position of our destination to just tell one of our game objects to just move. All right. So I can, so this is kind of a trick. I can just remember the location of destination. Or if I have kind of like hot spots in my game, places that I want to, like, okay, I want it to be right in this one place where I put this destination thing, for example. And I want this to be a destination, but probably when you think about your actual game running, you might not want white pills to be floating around out there. So you can kind of go in and just turn off the mesh render, and now it's not a problem. So kind of maybe a little game trick where you can put physical game objects in the scene. They have transforms. In fact, actually, for this, you probably wouldn't even have used of anything with a mesh. You would have used an empty game object to place it there. But I like the meshes to, so that you can quickly see where your hot spots are. So we'll leave him in view for right now. Now, what we want to do is we want to have, let's just work with player one for right now. We want to have player one be able to get to this location. Okay. So I'm going to show you, we're going to get some of the meat of this working, and then I'll have you do a little bit of research, but I'll give you a hint for how to accomplish it. All right, so we want to make this destination game object available to our player one's script, so that we now we have the location of where we're trying to get to. Okay, so I'll go to my player one script, and I'm going to say public game object. We'll call this guy destination. Now I'm going to start naming stuff with a little bit better naming conventions than I've used up to this point. Like I'm not a huge fan of my TextMeshPro variable, but damage is done. But a lot of times, especially as you start thinking about, we start working with the different kinds of components in Unity, you might want to have variable names that include in them the kind of animal you're dealing with here. So I'm going to have a public variable of type game object, and he's going to be our destination guy, but I put geo game object at the end of it. So we remember that that's the kind of animal we're dealing with. He's a full-fledged game object that may have components hanging off him or something that we can go and dig down to if we want to get the rigid body or something from one of them. But in terms of the variable we're dealing with right now, what he is at the top level is a game object. And this variable name reminds us of that. All right, so I just made it public, so I don't forget. I'm not going to go write any more code this exact second. I'm going to go back and let's hook it up, because this is that moment when you might forget to hook it up. And then you get weird behavior, and then you change 50 things in your game and wonder why, oh, nothing's working, but I did the same thing that you did. And then you bring me your laptop, and I have to go hunt for what you didn't do, because I've done that 50 times in the past. So learn from my own mistakes. As soon as you ask for something to be public, go ahead and hook it up. So we'll scroll down here. Here's our destination game object. So we're going to go ahead and drag our destination game object in there. So now we have that data. Okay. So I'll go back to my script. Well, let's go ahead and run this real quick just to see where everything is currently positioned. All right. So we see our destination just a little bit kind of in the corner of our camera there. So and I think Mike 1 was our player 1. We're going to go ahead and force him to be at this new location, just kind of messing around with working with transforms and things like that. So destination is in world space. That is, it's not the child of another game object. Player 1 is in world space. So we're going to be working with the position guy here. So when we start, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this game object's transform position. Actually, is there a set function? Set position, maybe? Ooh, there is a set position and rotation. No, but it still takes in vector threes, so it doesn't really help us. But since we just stumbled upon it, this is another nice little function. You can programmatically put things into folders, as I've said. You know, we've gone into Unity and we drug our things as children of other game objects. If there was a reason for you to do that in code, you can by setting a game object's parent to some other game object. Then he becomes a child. He becomes a folder within that. That's not what we want in this case, but since it popped up there, I figure I'd mention it. So we're going to set this guy's position equal to a new vector 3. So we are setting the game object that owns this script, which is our player 1's game object. And we want to change his position to be a new vector 3. What vector 3? The same vector 3 as our destination. We actually don't need to create a brand new vector 3 in this case to accomplish this. We can just say this dot destination geo dot transform dot position. We'll just set those two guys equal to each other for this exact moment. This eventually will start coming down to one of those kind of pass by value versus pass by reference type things, where if you have a pointer to a vector 3 and you start making changes, how does it behave? Vector 3s behave like structs, not like objects. So they are, everything changes by value. So once I set the position here, my game object, my player 1 game object, his position is this vector 3. And it's a copy of that vector 3, not the original one. So if I change the position of the destination, the guy won't automatically drag with it. But this should just bring them together programmatically. I think he might have slammed into him. Actually, I think there's if you watch what happened here, there was because there's colliders on these guys. So I think there might have been a somebody call the paramedics. All right. So maybe we instead just well, doesn't really matter for right now. What I might do in this case, since the exact position, having them literally be in the same exact point in space at the same time when they have collision boxes, maybe isn't the best idea. I could just turn the collision box off and that would probably look better, but I could then now make a new vector 3 and say, get close to him, but maybe offset the X by a little bit so he's kind of next to him or something like that. Okay? Things for you to play around with, but this is kind of, I think, the fun of Unity where, you know, we were just wondering why there was violence involved in this, and it was because we have colliders and things like that at play. So sometimes you have to ask yourself those questions. All right, so what I want to do for homework is go ahead and put it in Keynote here so you have your hint. So homework, make the player 1 game object move toward the destination game object over time at we're just going to call it reasonable speed. Okay. So we're not trying to just have him teleport from here to here. We want to see him moving towards that position. All right. And I'll kind of show you on the screen real quick just for your, but if I go in, I say vector 3 dot move towards. There's a function called move towards. There are other ways of doing this, so I encourage you to kind of play around with it. But notice there's a method in vector 3 called move towards. It's a static method. How do we know? Because we're calling it with the name of the class, vector 3. And if you look at the information in there, it says what's its current location, what's its target, and what's the maximum amount of distance you want him to move per time change. So the hints here would be use move towards, and you're probably going to need time delta time. Remember that guy that allows us to know how much time has passed since the last frame, i.e. how much time has passed since we last moved him a little. So he's going to be little nudges, right? And one thing to expect is you might get a little bit of kind of jerky movement. There's a couple of alternatives to this that actually use this that kind of smooth it out. Feel free to play around with that stuff, but right now we're just getting some of those major main components to under our belt. Questions, comments, concerns, bribes. All right. See everybody on Friday. We do have class Friday, right?
No.
Unfortunately, don't you love class? You're spending you don't love my class?
This one's fun.
You're spending so much money on college these days. You got to get as much out of it as possible, right?
If you could help me with this really dumb error, I can't.
Oh, I'm sure it's super stupid. That's on that's on
So
recording
on
too.
all
Give me
my-
1 second. Let me just stop the recording.
Nice.
Oh, Cole gave me the correct answer on here earlier.